This is an engine that I feel like Cummins wishes people would just forget about. Come on, Alex, this engine was made for military use. Can't be that bad. This engine was bad, terrible. Welcome back, I'm Alex. Last week we talked about the 5 most iconic diesel engines ever put into a pickup truck. This week we're going on the other end of the spectrum. We're talking about the 5 biggest pieces of hot garbage diesel engines that have unfortunately made their ways into heavy-duty pickup trucks, and potentially engines that you should avoid. Starting off, I figured we'd give an honorable mention to the Oldsmobile Diesel, which GM made starting in 1978. This diesel was technically not necessarily considered or meant to be used in a pickup truck, although it did find its way into some 2-wheel drive C10 pickup trucks. This engine was a diabolical disaster from the get-go. The whole idea behind the Oldsmobile Diesel engine was for GM to have a more fuel-efficient option than their thirsty V8 gas engines, but instead of designing and implementing a whole brand new engine, GM thought, well, maybe we could save a little bit of money and just use a stock 350 engine and just kind of turn it into a diesel. Well, with diesel engines having much higher cylinder pressures, it was terrible. It was a terrible, terrible engine. I'd be hard pressed for anyone to kind of find one these days, which is why it's just a nice honorary mention. Getting into our list at number 5, and this was actually a little bit of a tricky choice, but I ended up going with the LML Duramax. This engine ran from 2011 to 2016 and it was a pretty big step up in terms of performance and power on the Duramax engine spectrum. At the time, it produced 397 horsepower as well as 765 pound-feet of torque. But in order to make that extra power, GM implemented the wonderful CP4 Bosch fuel pump, which, as many of you guys probably know, is or can cause a lot of headaches. The good old Bosch CP4 fuel pump has actually been used by all 3 major manufacturers. In fact, this 6.7 liter Powerstroke still has a Bosch CP4 fuel pump in it, to my dismay. But unlike this engine, which doesn't necessarily experience that many fuel pump failures, that LML Duramax, it was a pretty big problem. And well, it didn't have a factory lift pump, which some people say certainly could exaggerate the CP4 problems, and proper maintenance of your fuel system is absolutely critical with those engines. The LML Duramax was also the first Duramax diesel to come with an SCR system and diesel exhaust fluid. As a diesel mechanic, that system, the SCR system, is probably the least reliable of the emission systems. And well, the LML Duramax was famous for DEF header problems, NOx sensors failing. Personally, I don't really like any diesel engines in this sort of time frame from 2012 to 2015. In 2012, most on-road diesel engines were all implementing their SCR systems as well as diesel exhaust fluid, and manufacturers were struggling with understanding how to implement this new emission system effectively and somewhat reliably, and it ended up having just a lot of problems. This LML Duramax was no exception. The first generation of 6.7 Powerstroke from 2011 to 2014 was kind of a trash engine.
Okay, that might have been a little aggressive, but the first gen did have a number of problems.
Had a ton of emission problems, had turbo problems, leaking radiators. It was not a really good engine either. And I actually thought about potentially putting that first generation of Powerstroke engine as my number 5 worst engines. But my point is, diesel engines in this time frame, they had a lot of problems. Moving on to my number 4 engine, we got to go back to the 90s for this old girl, and she competed directly with my own 7.3 liter Powerstroke. It is the 6.5 liter Detroit diesel V8 in the GM and Chevy trucks, and this engine ran from 1992 to 2000, and it was a decent workhorse. It got the job done for most people, but in my opinion, I think the engine had a fair amount of problems. I think reliability was not its strong suit, and the engines it competed with, like the 7.3 or the 5.9, it was just nowhere near as durable. The 6.5 came with a respectable 215 horsepower, 430 pound-feet of torque, which is actually more than what this engine, this 7.3, rolled off the factory line with, at least in 1995. However, there were often complaints of this engine just being or feeling underpowered and being a little bit gutless. The 6.5-liter diesel was supposed to be a more fuel-efficient option in comparison to GM's gas-guzzling V8, so it was the economic choice. It wasn't really the top dog engine. That was supposed to be the 454 big block. And to me, it does feel like it's a little bit of an afterthought for GM. It's not their top priority, where Ford and Dodge had switched gears a little bit and understood that the diesel engines were going to be the future workhorses of these HD engines. I think GM was still a little bit stuck in the past with that mentality. The biggest issue with these engines was the injection pump failures, or specifically the pump driver module, or the PDM. It was on the side of the injection pump, and the injection pump was right in the middle of the banks, and it would just get too hot and, well, it would fail, causing a whole bunch of fueling problems. Additionally, these engines had harmonic balancers that would often fail, which could snap the crankshaft. Cylinder heads would crack. Engine blocks were known to crack. Had a weak cooling system, so these engines, when they were worked somewhat hard, could often overheat. The engine also had turbo wastegate problems, and the turbo itself was tiny, which caused a lot of back pressure, which could increase the likelihood of overheating. And some of these engines even came with an EGR system, which is certainly going to reduce the life of the engine. Moving into our top 3 worst diesel engines, we're just gonna shine that up a little bit because we might be entering into Ford territory. At number 3, one of the more famous engines, it's the 6.0 Powerstroke, baby. Now, I did recently make a video about all the issues surrounding the 6-liter Powerstroke, but in 2003, the 6-liter was born.
The 7.3 was not designed to run with emissions, and it couldn't meet the new emission protocols, so it was dropped. And well, Ford and Navistar once again teamed up to build another platform, this 6-liter.
Little did Ford know they were about to be entering about a decade of hurt. There's a couple things that I actually don't mind about the 6-liter. First of all, it can make and does make some pretty darn good power. Secondly, it sounds like a bat out of hell when you get on that throttle. Thirdly, the bottom ends are apparently extremely strong, with guys running like 1,000 horsepower with stock bottom ends. So it's not all bad. But overall, the 6.0 was just, it was really not a good engine, plain and simple, from the oil cooler problems overheating the engine, causing lots of issues, EGR coolers cracking or clogging, EGR valves failing, VGT turbo seizing up and failing, the FICM, or the fuel injection control module, failing because of low voltage. How could we forget the good old head gaskets blowing out? Now, for whatever reason, Ford and Navistar went from going with 6 head bolts per cylinder in the 7.3 to only 4 head bolts per cylinder with the 6-liter, and some people speculate this is why there are so many head gasket issues with this engine. Another reason why people speculate that the head gaskets fail in these engines is because these head bolts are torque to yield bolts. Torque to yield essentially means the bolts are stretched into place. I don't necessarily believe this, because torque to yield bolts are extremely precise with their torque figures as well as their clamping force. And this engine was a HEMI injection system, meaning it uses high pressure engine oil to fire off the injectors, which at times could also be somewhat problematic. So overall, there was just a lot of things that went wrong on the 6.0, which is why we see it here at number 3 on my list. The silver lining, I guess, is that we now know all the problems with the 6-liter, and you can usually find them pretty cheap because people are a little bit afraid of them. So if you find a good cheap 6-liter and you're willing to put some time and some money in it to bulletproof the engine, you can end up with a pretty decent, fun engine that does sound pretty freaking good. Moving on to our number 2 engine, really getting into some nice boat anchors here. And this is an engine that I feel like Cummins wishes people would just forget about. And it is the 5-liter V8 engine in the Nissan Titan XD's This engine ran from 2016 to 2019 before it fizzled out like a nice fart in the wind. These engines had fuel pump problems, crankshafts breaking, EGR issues, and tons of emission-related problems. But I think the biggest problem of them all is that there just wasn't that many people who know how to work on them, and I guess the support from Cummins wasn't great either, so you just didn't have that many people who actually knew how to fix the engine. There's countless stories of guys with check engine lights taking their trucks into the dealership under warranty, waiting for weeks, months for their trucks to be fixed because they're either waiting for parts or waiting for tech helplines to get back to them. And these engines just seem like a little bit of a nightmare when it comes to trying to get them fixed. I can attest firsthand using Cummins diagnostic software. Insight is not the most intuitive thing to use. So with these engines, you have people who don't really know how to fix them. It's riddled with problems, and it's one thing to have emission-related codes. It's another thing to have techs that just don't really know how to fix them. And while Cummins has made some fantastic engines in the past, last week we talked about both the 6.7 Cummins as well as the legendary 5.9 Cummins, which in my opinion is the best engine ever put into a pickup truck. And well, unfortunately you can't win them all, and this was what we call a swing and a miss for Cummins, and that's why it's the number 2 engine, my number 1 biggest pile of flaming hot garbage in terms of diesel engines is the 6.4 Powerstroke. Now, sometimes guys like myself, we talk about issues with engines like the CP4 fuel pump with the LML Duramax, which we mentioned earlier. Yes, it is certainly a problem to be aware of, but there are plenty of examples of those LML Duramax engines running high mileages with their stock CP4 fuel pump. But when we talk about the 6.4 Powerstroke, this engine was bad. Guys with 6 liters make fun of guys with 6.4 liters. That's how bad this engine was. Ultimately, this is what made Ford and Navistar cut ties with one another, because the 6.4 was just somewhat inexcusable. The 6.4 was introduced in 2008 and ran until 2010, until Ford had seen enough and pulled the plug and introduced the 6.7 liter Powerstroke in 2011. There's a laundry list of problems with this engine, including cracked pistons, valve train problems, oil dilution, DPF issues, EGR problems, and the list just kind of keeps on growing from there. It's just not a great engine. Guys that say these engines aren't that bad probably own one, and well, they need to fall asleep somehow at night. But if you're looking for a cheap Powerstroke diesel, you're better off getting a 6 liter. Yes, you're gonna have to spend some money to probably put some repairs into it, but you're gonna end up with a decent engine, where this 6.4, in my opinion, is just a little bit of a lost cause. Well, that's my opinion of the top 5 worst diesel engines ever put into a pickup truck. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Always love hearing what you guys have to say. If you did like the video, don't forget to leave that thumbs up. And if you like cool stuff like this, don't forget to subscribe. We're almost at 100,000 subscribers and appreciate the support. But anyways, enough of me. We'll see you in the next freaking video.